Officer Brian Thompson's career hangs in the balance after a racially charged traffic stop involving Judge Samuel Carter, a man who is everything Brian didn't expect. As the fallout from the incident ripples through their lives and the community, each man is forced to confront the biases, truths, and emotions they've kept hidden. With public scrutiny mounting and personal stakes rising, the question remains, will this be the end of Officer Thompson's career, or the beginning of a new path toward redemption? And for Judge Carter, how will he navigate the responsibility thrust upon him as a symbol of justice in a broken system? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the busy streets as Officer Brian Thompson sat in his patrol car, his gaze lazily drifting over the passing vehicles. It was a relatively quiet day, but the subtle hum of the city never really ceased. He could hear his partner, Officer Danny Walsh, tapping rhythmically on the dashboard, clearly growing bored with the uneventful patrol. Brian glanced at his watch, willing the minutes to pass faster. His mind wandered, thinking about his life beyond the badge, his wife's cold stares over breakfast lately, the distant relationship he had with his teenage daughter, and the mounting pressure at work. They'd had another department meeting on community relations and bias awareness just last week. His supervisors droned on and on about how they needed to be more mindful of their interactions with the public. Brian hated those meetings. In his mind, he treated everyone the same. At least, that's what he told himself. Suddenly, something caught his eye. A sleek, black car, its tinted windows reflecting the bright sunlight, creeping through the intersection ahead. His eyes narrowed. It wasn't speeding, in fact, it was moving slower than the traffic around it. Suspicion flared in his chest. "Danny," Brian said, jerking his chin toward the car. "That one." Walsh looked over, raising an eyebrow. "What about it? Look at that ride. Fancy. Let's see who's inside." Without waiting for his partner's input, Brian flipped on the siren, signaling for the car to pull over. Walsh frowned but said nothing, used to Brian's whims on these patrols. The black car smoothly pulled to the side of the road. It was too calm, too polished, and that only fed Brian's instincts. Who drives like that, unless they've got something to hide? As Brian approached the vehicle, his hand rested instinctively near his taser. He wasn't expecting trouble, but you could never be too careful. The driver's window rolled down, and Brian found himself staring at a tall, distinguished black man, his expression calm but aware. The man was dressed sharply in a dark, tailored suit, the subtle sheen of the material hinting at wealth. "Good afternoon, officer," the man said in a measured, polite tone, his eyes steady on Brian's. "Is there something wrong?" Brian scrutinized the man's face. His composure seemed unnatural, too assured. This wasn't the look of someone who was just caught in a routine stop. There was no nervousness, no fumbling, just that steady, calm demeanor that irked Brian for reasons he couldn't fully explain. "I need to see your license and registration," Brian replied, keeping his tone firm, trying to assert control over the situation. He wasn't going to let this guy think he was any different from anyone else. The man didn't hesitate. His movements were slow and deliberate as he reached into the glove compartment and produced the documents. "Of course, officer," he said, handing them over. "But may I ask what I did wrong?" Brian glanced at the license, barely hearing the man's question. Samuel Carter. The name didn't stand out, but the title beside it did. Judge Samuel Carter. Brian felt his jaw tighten, so the guy was a judge. Brian knew he should have stopped there, maybe even apologized and let him go. But something about the man's calm confidence, about his position, made Brian's pride flare. He couldn't back down now. "You were driving too slow and your windows are too tinted," Brian said, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. Judge Carter raised an eyebrow, though his composure remained intact. "Officer, my windows comply with state regulations. You can check the code, and as for my speed, I was driving within the limit." Brian's temper flared. He hated being corrected. It wasn't the words that got to him. It was the way Carter said them, like he was untouchable, like his title made him superior. Brian had dealt with plenty of entitled people before, and it always set his nerves on edge. He stepped closer, his presence looming over the car. "I know the law," You don't need to tell me about regulations, Brian snapped, his hand twitching slightly at his side. Now, step out of the car. Carter's expression finally changed. Just a flicker of something that passed through his eyes, a blend of frustration and resignation. He sighed softly and undid his seatbelt, stepping out of the car with the same controlled, deliberate movements. He was tall, a good few inches above Brian, but he didn't make any sudden moves. He stood beside the car, his back straight, and looked directly into Brian's eyes. "Officer, I'd advise you to reconsider this course of action," he said, his voice still steady, though there was an unmistakable warning beneath the words. "I'm sure you don't want to escalate this unnecessarily." Brian felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't used to people like Carter standing up to him. Usually people folded, especially when they saw his uniform and his authority. But this man didn't seem fazed. That calmness, that infuriating calmness, ate at Brian. "What's that supposed to mean?" Brian asked, stepping even closer, invading Carter's personal space. "You threatening me?" Carter shook his head, his expression softening, though his eyes remained sharp. "No, officer. I don't threaten. I'm simply asking you to consider your actions carefully. There's no need for this." The air between them crackled with tension. Brian could feel the weight of his partner's eyes on him, though Walsh remained a few steps back, clearly uncomfortable with how things were unfolding. He could hear the shuffle of footsteps, passers-by watching from a distance, sensing the growing tension, but unsure if they should intervene. "Brian," Walsh finally said, stepping forward. His voice was quiet, cautious. "Everything checks out here. Let's just move on." But Brian couldn't let it go. His pride wouldn't let him. He felt like he was being tested, pushed into a corner. If he let Carter walk away now, it would feel like losing, like admitting he was wrong. And Brian wasn't ready to admit that. Not here, not in front of everyone. He stepped back slightly, his mind racing, searching for a way to salvage his authority without making things worse. His pride warred with his instincts. But then, before he could say another word, Judge Carter spoke again, his voice low but unmistakably firm. "You can choose how you handle this, Officer Thompson," Carter said, addressing Brian by name after glancing at his badge. "But remember, your actions reflect on more than just yourself. They reflect on your profession and the people you serve." The weight of those words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. For a brief moment, Brian felt exposed, like the mask he wore every day as a police officer had been stripped away, leaving him vulnerable. Carter wasn't just talking to him as a man of the law. He was talking to him as a human being, as someone who had the power to make choices that would ripple far beyond this moment. For the first time since the stop began, Brian hesitated. His hand, still resting near his taser, slowly dropped to his side. He could feel his partner's silent relief behind him, the tension easing ever so slightly. Without another word, Brian thrust the license and registration back toward Carter, not even bothering to make eye contact. "You're free to go," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of traffic. Judge Carter didn't say anything in response. He simply took the documents, gave Brian a small nod, and returned to his car. A moment later, the sleek black vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging back into the flow of traffic, as if nothing had happened. But for Brian, everything had changed. The gentle hum of his car engine was drowned out by the rush of thoughts swirling in Judge Samuel Carter's mind as he drove away from the tense interaction with Officer Brian Thompson. His hands were steady on the steering wheel, but a deep frustration brewed inside him. No matter how many times he experienced it, the sting of being judged by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character never seemed to dull. As the city streets passed in a blur, he reflected on the absurdity of it all. He was a judge, one of the highest-ranking officials in the legal system, a man who had spent his life fighting for justice and equality. Yet, in the eyes of that officer, all that had mattered in that moment was his skin color and the type of car he drove. Samuel had worked too hard, struggled too long, to let this encounter shake him to his core. But it wasn't just about him. It was about the system. The system he was a part of, the system he had sworn to uphold, and the system that still harbored men like Officer Thompson. The thought unsettled him. He had tried so hard to believe in the justice he dispensed every day, yet there were moments like this when he questioned whether the scales were ever truly balanced. He arrived at his home, a modern yet modest house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. His wife, Evelyn, was already there, sitting on the porch, a novel resting in her lap. Her eyes lifted as his car pulled into the driveway, and she immediately noticed something was off. Evelyn had been married to Samuel for nearly 20 years, and in that time she had come to know the subtle nuances of his demeanor. As soon as he stepped out of the car and approached her, she could sense the tension in his posture. His usually composed face carried the weight of something unspoken. "What happened?" she asked softly, closing her book and standing to meet him. He shook his head, as if trying to dismiss it, but she reached for his hand, gently guiding him to sit beside her on the porch swing. "Samuel, don't brush me off. I can see something's bothering you." He let out a long sigh, running a hand over his tired face. "I had an incident today with a police officer." Evelyn's expression darkened with concern. "What kind of incident?" "A traffic stop. Routine on the surface, but we both know it wasn't really about the traffic," Samuel said, his voice laced with frustration. "He pulled me over, treated me like a criminal, all because I was driving a nice car and I didn't look like I belonged in it." Evelyn's hand tightened around his. "Did he know who you were?" "No," Samuel replied. "Not until the end. And even then, I don't think it mattered. It's the principle of it. After all these years, after everything we fought for, this still happens. I'm still judged the same way I was when I was a law student in my 20s. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line, her anger barely concealed. "And yet, you still believe in this system." Samuel's gaze shifted to the horizon, the last sliver of sunlight fading behind the trees. "I have to. I can't give up on it, Evelyn. If I do, what was the point of all those years we spent working within it? Trying to change it from the inside?" Evelyn studied his face for a long moment, seeing the exhaustion in his eyes. She knew how deeply he cared about his work, about his role in trying to make the justice system fairer. But she also knew the toll it took on him. Over the years, he had seen so much injustice, so much pain, and it was beginning to wear on him. "Maybe it's time to do more than just work within the system," she said gently. "Maybe it's time to speak out." Samuel remained silent, contemplating her words. He knew she was right. The weight of his silence had grown heavier over the years, and though he had always believed in fighting from within, perhaps it was time to confront the system more directly. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Brian Thompson sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the cold cup of coffee in front of him. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint sounds of a news anchor on the TV in the other room were the only noises breaking the thick silence. His wife, Grace, had taken their daughter to a friend's house, leaving Brian with too much time to think. The interaction with Judge Carter, though he still didn't fully understand the man's importance, had been gnawing at him all day. When he'd returned to the precinct after the traffic stop, his partner, Danny, had barely said a word to him. Brian knew Danny wasn't pleased with how things had played out, but he also knew that Danny wasn't going to say anything. That wasn't the way things worked between them. Cops didn't criticize other cops, at least not openly. But now, sitting here alone, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong, more than wrong. He hadn't just lost control of the situation, he had crossed a line. The look in Carter's eyes had stayed with him, that unblinking, steady gaze that had said more than any words could. Brian had seen anger in people's eyes before, fear, hatred even. But Carter's eyes were different. There was a disappointment there, a kind of sadness that unnerved Brian more than anything else. He ran his hands through his hair and let out a frustrated sigh. Why had he done it? Why had he pushed so hard when there was no real reason? He had been in control. He could have de-escalated the situation at any point. But something inside him, something dark and twisted, had refused to let him back down. His thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of his phone. He picked it up, expecting a text from his wife, but instead saw a message from his precinct captain. "Thompson, come in tomorrow. We need to talk." Brian stared at the message for a long time, his stomach sinking. He knew what that meant. The judge must have filed a complaint, and now Internal Affairs would get involved. His mind raced with what might come next: disciplinary action, suspension, or worse. But more than that, the realization hit him that his reputation, something he had worked years to build, could come crashing down over a few moments of poor judgment. Brian rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the fog of guilt and worry. He wasn't a bad cop. He wasn't one of those cops, the kind who abused their power just for the sake of it. At least, that's what he'd always believed. But today, he had acted like one of them. And the thought that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as different from them as he'd always convinced himself weighed heavily on him. The sound of the front door opening snapped him out of his thoughts. Grace and his daughter, Emma, came in laughing, Emma recounting some story about her friend's birthday party. But as soon as Grace saw Brian's face, her laughter faded. "What's wrong?" she asked, instantly reading his mood. Brian didn't answer right away. He looked at his daughter, still buzzing with excitement from her day, and forced a smile. "Nothing, just work stuff," he said, brushing it off. He didn't want to explain. Not now, not with Emma around. But Grace wasn't fooled. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, a silent understanding passing between them. She nodded, knowing he wasn't ready to talk, and took Emma upstairs to get ready for bed. As Brian sat alone in the kitchen again, he knew he couldn't avoid what was coming. Tomorrow, he'd have to face the consequences of his actions. And more than that, he'd have to confront the person he was becoming. The kind of cop he had always promised himself he would never be. The courtroom was unusually quiet for such a high-profile case. Every seat was filled, yet the tension in the air seemed to suppress any noise. Journalists lined the back row, their notebooks ready, while the gallery held an array of people: activists, concerned citizens, and some who were just curious onlookers. The media had turned this into a sensation. A police officer facing disciplinary action for misconduct was rare enough, but when the other party was a respected judge, it was bound to attract attention. Judge Samuel Carter had deliberately chosen to sit in the audience today rather than preside over the matter. He was not here to pass judgment. This was not his courtroom, and he wanted the system to handle things the way it would for anyone else. That decision had taken weeks of contemplation. His pride as a man had urged him to press charges, to make Officer Thompson pay for the indignity he had suffered. But his belief in the system he had sworn to uphold made him resist the urge to wield his power as a weapon. Samuel sat silently, his expression neutral, watching the proceedings unfold before him. He had come alone today, against his wife Evelyn's wishes. She wanted to be by his side to show support, but Samuel had insisted. This was something he had to face alone. Across the room, Brian Thompson sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his union lawyer. His uniform was crisp, his demeanor subdued, but there was an unmistakable tension in his posture. His usual confidence had withered under the pressure of the last few weeks. He felt like a caged animal, scrutinized from every angle, unable to escape the consequences of his own actions. The internal investigation had moved quickly, faster than Brian had anticipated. His captain had kept things quiet at first, hoping it would blow over, but once the media got wind of the story, once they realized the man involved was a sitting judge, the situation spiraled out of control. Brian had been placed on administrative leave, and now his career hung in the balance. The chairperson of the inquiry, a stern-faced woman in her 50s, cleared her throat and addressed the courtroom. "Officer Brian Thompson, this inquiry is to determine whether your actions during the traffic stop involving Judge Samuel Carter were in violation of department policy and whether disciplinary measures are warranted." Brian's heart pounded in his chest as the chairperson spoke. He had been through interviews, interrogations, and endless meetings with his lawyer over the past few weeks, but this public reckoning, felt different. It was as if the walls were closing in on him, and every eye in the room was waiting for him to break. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman in a dark suit, stood and began to speak. "The facts are clear. Officer Thompson, during a routine traffic stop, escalated a situation without cause. Judge Carter complied fully with all requests, and yet Officer Thompson proceeded to humiliate and harass him, even after it was clear that no law had been broken. This kind of behavior is unacceptable from anyone, let alone a member of law enforcement." The prosecutor's words stung, but they were nothing compared to the quiet fury Brian had felt from his own colleagues in the days leading up to this. Some supported him, seeing him as a victim of political pressure, while others whispered that he had gone too far, that he had let his temper get the best of him. But no one had said it to his face. They were too polite for that. His lawyer, a seasoned man with gray hair and a calm demeanor, rose to make his defense. While Officer Thompson's actions were regrettable, they were not criminal. He did not use excessive force, and Judge Carter was not physically harmed. Officer Thompson has a spotless record up until this incident, and we believe that with proper training and a temporary suspension, he can return to duty with a better understanding of his responsibilities. Brian listened to his lawyer's words, but they felt hollow. He knew the real issue wasn't about physical harm, it was about the emotional and psychological damage he had inflicted. He had crossed a line, not with his hands, but with his attitude, his assumptions, and his pride. And sitting there, he wasn't sure if any amount of legal maneuvering could fix that. The prosecutor called her first witness. Judge Samuel Carter, please take the stand. Samuel stood slowly, his tall frame commanding the room's attention as he made his way to the witness stand. He moved with the same grace and composure he always carried, but inside, there was a storm of emotions. He had thought about this moment for weeks. Would he use this opportunity to speak his truth, or would he hold back, allowing the system to function as it was meant to? The room was silent as Samuel took his seat and swore the oath. The prosecutor approached him with a soft tone, as if recognizing the delicate nature of the situation. Judge Carter, can you describe the events of that day from your perspective? Samuel took a deep breath before speaking. It was a routine traffic stop. I was on my way home when I was pulled over by Officer Thompson. I complied with all of his requests, provided my license and registration, and answered his questions. However, it became clear that Officer Thompson was not satisfied with my responses, despite there being no violation of the law. His words were calm, deliberate, but every syllable carried the weight of the injustice he had experienced. The room hung on his every word. Did you feel threatened during the interaction? The prosecutor asked, her voice soft but probing. Samuel paused, his eyes flickering with an emotion he had worked hard to suppress. I didn't feel physically threatened, but I felt disrespected. I felt humiliated. I felt that I was being judged not based on my actions, but based on my appearance. There it was, the truth he had wrestled with for weeks. As the words left his mouth, there was a collective intake of breath in the room. It was the heart of the matter, the core of what had brought them all here. The prosecutor nodded, giving him a moment before continuing. Judge Carter, do you believe Officer Thompson's actions were motivated by bias? Samuel's gaze turned briefly to Brian, who sat still, eyes downcast. The room waited for his answer, but Samuel hesitated. He had thought long and hard about this question, and while he knew the answer in his heart, he also knew the implications of speaking it out loud. I can't speak to what was in Officer Thompson's heart, Samuel finally said, his voice steady. But his actions suggested that he saw me as a threat before he knew anything about me. I believe his assumptions were based on how I look, not who I am. The prosecutor nodded and stepped back, allowing the defense attorney his turn. He approached cautiously, knowing he had to tread carefully. Judge Carter, I understand the frustration you must have felt during that encounter, but do you believe Officer Thompson had any reason to think there might be a legitimate threat? Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly. I was driving under the speed limit. I was fully compliant. I offered no resistance. What possible threat could I have posed? The lawyer nodded, backing off quickly. He knew there was no way to spin this. No further questions. Samuel stepped down from the stand, his shoulders feeling lighter yet burdened at the same time. He had spoken his truth, but whether it would change anything remained to be seen. As he returned to his seat, the inquiry continued, with witness after witness speaking to Officer Thompson's character, his history of good behavior, and the stress of the job. But no matter how much they tried to paint Brian as a dedicated officer, the stain of that traffic stop loomed large. Finally, the chairperson announced a recess, stating they would deliberate before delivering their verdict. As people began to file out of the room, Samuel stood slowly, preparing to leave. He noticed Brian lingering by the door, as if waiting for something. Their eyes met for the first time since the inquiry began, and for a moment, neither man moved. The weight of everything unsaid hung between them: apologies, anger, regret, and the long, complicated history that had brought them both to this point. Brian opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Samuel offered a small nod, acknowledging him, but didn't stop. He walked past Brian, out of the courtroom, and into the daylight. The verdict, whatever it may be, would come soon enough. But for now, Samuel had done his part. Whether Brian's fate was sealed by this inquiry or not, Samuel knew that this was about more than one man's actions. It was about a system that needed to change, and a society that had to reckon with the weight of its prejudices. The inquiry's verdict loomed like a dark cloud over Officer Brian Thompson's head as he sat in the quiet of his own home. The walls seemed to close in on him, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on his chest with a suffocating force. His wife, Grace, moved silently in the kitchen, but the usual warmth between them had been replaced by a chilling distance. She had always been his biggest supporter, but even she couldn't ignore the seriousness of the charges against him. Brian's eyes followed her movements as she prepared dinner, though he couldn't bring himself to speak. He had never been good with words in moments like this. In his line of work, action mattered more than words. But in his personal life, the silence was unbearable. His daughter, Emma, had stopped asking questions too. She had heard enough murmured conversations between her parents late at night to know that something wasn't right with her father's job. As the weight of it all crushed him from the inside, Brian's phone buzzed on the table, startling him. He glanced at the screen and saw the name, Captain O'Hara. He let it ring twice more before answering, his heart pounding in his chest. "Thompson," he said, his voice hoarse. "Brian, the deliberation's in. You need to come down to the station." The captain said. His voice was gruff, but there was an undercurrent of sympathy there. Captain O'Hara had known Brian for years, since his rookie days on the force. Brian had been a solid officer, always keeping his head down, doing his job. But one bad decision had changed everything. "I'll be there," Brian replied, ending the call. He sat there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand, trying to muster the courage to face what was coming. Grace approached, her eyes full of concern. "That was your captain?" she asked softly. Brian nodded, running a hand over his face. "The verdict's in. I have to go down to the station." She was quiet for a moment, her face a mixture of worry and something deeper, something Brian couldn't quite identify. "What do you think will happen?" Brian didn't know. He didn't even want to guess. "I'm not sure. But whatever happens, Grace, I just want you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't want to bring this into our lives." Grace took a step closer, her hand resting on his shoulder. "I know, Brian. I know you didn't, but sometimes intent isn't enough." Her words hit him harder than he expected, but there was no malice in her tone, just a quiet resignation. She loved him, but she couldn't ignore the consequences of his actions, just like he couldn't. "I should go," he said, standing up from the table. Grace didn't stop him, but he felt her eyes on him as he grabbed his keys and left the house. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but the sound echoed in his mind like the end of something much larger. At the station, the atmosphere was tense. Brian walked through the familiar halls, feeling the stares of his colleagues. Some offered sympathetic nods, others barely looked at him. He had never felt more like an outsider in his own precinct. Captain O'Hara met him near the conference room, his face grim but not unkind. "Brian, you ready for this?" he asked, his eyes searching Brian's for any sign of the man he used to know. Brian nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was ready or not. "Let's get it over with." O'Hara clapped a hand on his shoulder, offering a small squeeze before leading him into the room where the inquiry board sat waiting. The chairperson, the same woman who had presided over the initial hearing, sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable. "Officer Thompson," she began, her voice firm but professional, "we've reviewed the evidence, the testimonies, and your record. While we recognize your years of service and your otherwise clean record, we cannot ignore the severity of your actions during the traffic stop involving Judge Samuel Carter." Brian's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The moment that would determine everything. The chairperson continued. We have decided to suspend you for 6 months without pay, during which time you will be required to complete mandatory bias training and community outreach programs. Additionally, you will be demoted from your current position. After your suspension, you may return to duty, but your conduct will be closely monitored. Any further infractions will result in immediate termination. The words hit Brian like a blow to the gut. 6 months without pay. A demotion. It wasn't as bad as it could have been. He had feared losing his badge altogether. But it was still a hard pill to swallow. He nodded slowly, his mind struggling to process what it all meant. Do you have anything to say? The chairperson asked, her gaze fixed on him. Brian hesitated, searching for the right words. Apologies danced on the tip of his tongue, but they felt hollow in the face of what had happened. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. I understand the decision, and I accept it. I know I made a mistake, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. The chairperson gave a curt nod, acknowledging his response. We hope you will use this time to reflect on your actions, Officer Thompson. This is a second chance. Not everyone gets one. With that, the meeting was adjourned. Brian stood, feeling the weight of the room's judgment lift ever so slightly, but the burden of his own guilt remained. Outside the station, Brian lingered by his car, staring at the sky, which was slowly darkening with the approach of evening. His mind was spinning with thoughts of what came next. 6 months. What would he do? How would he explain this to his family? Would they understand? And more importantly, how would he live with himself, knowing that this stain would never fully wash away? He was lost in his thoughts when he heard a voice behind him. Officer Thompson. Brian turned and saw Judge Samuel Carter standing there, his posture as composed as ever. For a moment, neither man spoke. The tension between them was palpable, the unspoken words from the inquiry still hanging in the air. I wasn't expecting to see you here, Brian said, his voice uncertain. I wasn't expecting to come, Samuel replied. But I thought we should talk. Brian nodded, though he wasn't sure what there was left to say. He had been dreading this conversation for weeks, but now that it was here, he felt strangely calm. I'm sorry, he said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. For everything. For how I treated you, for what I did. I know I can't take it back, but I am sorry. Samuel regarded him carefully, his eyes searching Brian's face for sincerity. After a long pause, he nodded. I believe you are. There was another silence, heavier this time, as both men stood there, 2 lives forever altered by a moment that neither could fully control. Finally, Samuel spoke again, his voice measured but softer than before. I don't need your apology, Officer Thompson. What I need is for you to understand that this isn't just about me. What happened that day, what happens every day to people who look like me, it's bigger than both of us. Brian swallowed hard, the weight of those words sinking in. He had spent weeks thinking about his own actions, his own mistakes, but he hadn't fully grasped the larger picture. It wasn't just about his lapse in judgment, it was about the system that had allowed him to make that mistake in the first place. I do understand, Brian said, though even as he said it, he knew there was still so much more he had to learn. I don't expect forgiveness, I just want to be better. Samuel gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then be better. Use this time to really think about what that means, not just for you but for everyone else. With that, Samuel turned and walked away, leaving Brian standing alone by his car, the echoes of their conversation reverberating in his mind. He knew Samuel was right. It wasn't just about him. It was about the system, the community, and the long road ahead toward justice and equality. As he drove home that evening, Brian felt the first stirrings of hope, not for an easy redemption, but for the chance to change, to become someone better than he had been. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead would be long, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could see a path forward. 6 months had passed since Officer Brian Thompson's suspension, and the city was settling into the familiar rhythm of summer. The streets bustled with activity as the long sunlit days drew people outdoors. For most, life had returned to normal. But for Brian, nothing had been normal since that fateful day. His days during the suspension had been quiet, reflective, and at times deeply uncomfortable. The mandatory bias training sessions were behind him now, but they had left a lasting impression. They had forced him to confront parts of himself he'd never been willing to see. The assumptions he made, the biases he carried without realizing it. The training hadn't been easy, and he had resisted at first. The sessions were filled with uncomfortable truths, stories from people who had lived experiences far removed from his own. But by the end, Brian had come to realize just how much he had taken for granted. He had also spent time working in community outreach programs, volunteering at local centers, and speaking with people who had been impacted by the same systemic issues he had once overlooked. Each encounter opened his eyes a little more, chipping away at the armor of ignorance he had worn for so long. And while he knew he was just beginning to understand the depth of the problem, he was determined to keep learning, keep growing. The suspension had hit his family hard. Without his salary, they had struggled financially. But Grace had stood by him. She had watched him slowly transform during these months, not just as a husband, but as a man reckoning with his place in the world. The distance that had grown between them after the incident was beginning to shrink, though the shadows of what had happened still lingered in their conversations, in the silences at the dinner table. On the morning of his first day back on the job, Brian stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his uniform. The once familiar routine felt strange now, almost foreign. The uniform didn't carry the same weight it used to. It no longer represented simple authority to him. Now, it represented responsibility. A responsibility to be better, to do better. Grace came up behind him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Are you ready?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his. Brian met her gaze in the mirror, a hint of uncertainty clouding his expression. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've spent so much time thinking about what I did wrong. Now I have to figure out how to make it right." "You've already started," she said, squeezing his shoulder gently. "Just take it one step at a time." He nodded, grateful for her steady presence. He didn't deserve her unwavering support, but he was determined to earn it now. He leaned down and kissed her on the forehead before heading out the door. As Brian walked into the precinct, the atmosphere was different from when he had left. There was no fanfare, no welcoming back party, just quiet acknowledgement from some of his colleagues, and indifference from others. He could feel the eyes on him as he passed through the hallways, but he kept his head down. He didn't expect respect or camaraderie right away. He knew he had to earn that back. His first day back was uneventful. He was assigned to desk duty for the time being, something that had frustrated him at first, but now felt like a small mercy. It gave him time to acclimate, to observe, and to slowly reintegrate into a world he had once taken for granted. The same old procedures, the same reports to file, yet it all felt different. Each call he logged, each name he entered into the system, carried new meaning. In the weeks that followed, Brian kept to himself. He focused on his work, speaking little, listening more. He knew some of his colleagues were still wary of him, while others were quietly supportive. But Brian didn't care about their opinions right now. What mattered was what he did next. Meanwhile, Judge Samuel Carter's life had continued, but not without its own changes. The encounter with Brian had forced Samuel to re-examine his place within the justice system. After the inquiry, he had returned to the bench, continuing to preside over cases with the same fairness and diligence that had earned him respect throughout his career. But something had shifted in him. The incident with Brian had left a deeper impact than he had anticipated. Samuel had always believed in the power of the law to bring about justice, but the experience with Brian had shaken his faith, not just in the system but in himself. He had spent his life navigating a world that often saw him as less than, no matter his accomplishments. And though he had risen to one of the highest positions in the legal field, he had learned the hard way that no amount of success could shield him from the biases that permeated society. The weeks following the inquiry had been filled with public attention. While Samuel had hoped the media storm would die down, it had only intensified. People wanted him to speak out, to become a symbol for change, but Samuel had resisted at first. He wasn't a politician or an activist. He was a judge, a man who believed in quiet, steady work. But as the pressure mounted, he realized that perhaps it was time to step outside his comfort zone. Evelyn, ever the voice of reason in his life, had encouraged him. "You've spent your career fighting for justice in the courtroom," she had said. "Now maybe it's time to fight for it out there too." And so slowly, Samuel began to speak out. He accepted invitations to panels, gave interviews, and lent his voice to conversations about racial bias in the justice system. He was careful in his words, measured, thoughtful, but he didn't shy away from the hard truths. He knew his experience with Officer Thompson was just one example of a much larger problem. But he also knew that his position gave him a platform to advocate for change. It was on one of those summer afternoons, several months after Brian had returned to duty, that their paths crossed again. Brian had been assigned to patrol duty in the downtown district. It was a hot day, the kind that made tempers flare and the city buzz with restless energy. As he walked his beat, he spotted a familiar figure across the street, Judge Samuel Carter, speaking with a group of community leaders outside a courthouse. Brian felt his heart skip a beat. He hadn't seen Carter since the inquiry, and the sight of him stirred up a mix of emotions: guilt, shame, and something close to respect. For a moment, Brian considered crossing the street and speaking to him, but he hesitated. What would he say? Was there even anything left to say? But before he could decide, Judge Carter turned and caught his eye. There was a brief flicker of recognition in his expression, but he didn't look away. Instead, he gave Brian a small nod, just like he had that day outside the courtroom after the verdict had been announced. It wasn't much, but to Brian, it felt like something. It felt like a second chance, not just from the system, but from the man he had wronged. That evening, Brian sat on the front steps of his home, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, a peaceful contrast to the storm of emotions inside him. Grace joined him after putting Emma to bed, sitting beside him in the fading light. "I saw him today," Brian said quietly, staring out at the street. "Judge Carter?" Brian nodded. "Yeah, he was downtown with some community leaders. I thought about going over to talk to him, but I didn't. I don't know if there's anything left to say." Grace looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Maybe you're right. Maybe there's nothing left to say. But that doesn't mean there's nothing left to do." Her words hung in the air, a gentle reminder that redemption wasn't about what you said. It was about what you did. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a better future. Brian had learned that the hard way. The road to redemption wasn't a straight line, and it wasn't something you could achieve overnight. It was a constant effort, a daily choice to be better than you were the day before. And though he wasn't sure if he'd ever fully redeem himself in the eyes of the world or in the eyes of Judge Carter, he knew he had to try. As the evening light faded, Brian reached for Grace's hand, holding it tightly. They sat there together, in the quiet, knowing that the road ahead would be long and uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Brian felt like he was on the right path. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.